Hello, my name is Todd Baginski. I'm an 11-time SharePoint MVP and a partner and CTO at my company Canvas. In this training module, I'm going to show you how to work with different JavaScript frameworks and libraries. This is section 1 of the Working with Different JavaScript Frameworks and Libraries training module. In this section, I will discuss different options to load JavaScript libraries. In this section, I will discuss how to install JavaScript libraries into SharePoint Framework web part projects, how to configure JavaScript library bundling, and then how to use JavaScript libraries in a web part. Installing JavaScript libraries and type definitions is very simple when you're working with the SharePoint framework. You can install the npm packages for the libraries you need in your web part by executing npm commands to install those libraries. Here you can see examples of using npm I jQuery -- save, as well as jQuery UI, Chartist, and Moment web part libraries. That's all you have to do to install the libraries in your web part. After you've installed the libraries in your web part, then you can install the type definitions for those libraries. The commands to install the type definitions will install the type definitions into the node_modules @types folder. You can see the commands here. For example, npm I @types/jQuery -D. You can also see here how type definitions can be installed for the jQuery UI and Chartist libraries. Some libraries, such as Moment, which is why it is exempted from the screenshot here, provides its own type definitions, so you don't need to install them yourself. By default, any dependencies you add are bundled into the web part bundle. In some cases, this is not ideal. You can choose to unbundle these dependencies from the web part bundle. The config.json file you see pictured on the screen here contains information about your bundles and any external dependencies. The entry region contains the default bundle information. In this case, the jQuery web part bundle. When you add more web parts to your solution, you will see one entry per web part. The externals section contains the libraries that are not bundled with the default bundle. Here you can see jQuery is in the externals section. It has been excluded from the default bundle because it has been added to the externals section. You can see that here with the red box inside of the externals section in the code. So how do you look at the impact bundling has? You can use the Webpack visualizer that comes with SharePoint Framework web parts. After you bundle your web parts with the command like gulp space bundle on the command line, you can then go into the dist folder and look at the HTML page that shows you the Webpack visualizer. Here you can see an example of one of the web parts I'll show you in our demo later, and it indicates that the Moment bundle, or the Moment library, pardon me, is 31% of the entire web part bundle. You want to avoid bundling when it's not needed, because some libraries are enormous. The Moment one is a good example of that. It's 429.5K per web part that gets added to the bundle. So it may be a good idea to not bundle that one with the particular web part if you happen to be using that web part on a lot of different places on the same page. The web part visualizer here, as I mentioned before, can be very helpful for you to inspect your bundles to see where you can make improvements. The next thing you need to do is import libraries into a web part. To do this, You simply use import statements in the web part class. Here you can see where I've imported jQuery, Chartist, Moment, and the jQuery UI libraries for use by this web part. If your library components use CSS, then you will need to use require statements in the web part class to load the CSS that those libraries require. Here I'm loading the jQuery UI and the Chartist CSS files for this web part. After you have done those previous steps, then you are free to use the libraries in the web part class. Here you can see where I'm using the Moment, jQuery, and Chartist libraries inside of my web part. In this demo, I'm going to show you how to use different options to load JavaScript libraries in your web part projects. Here's a look at the web part we're going to build inside of this demo. I'll show you how I was able to use the jQuery UI, Chartist, and Moment libraries with the SharePoint Framework web part. So what our web part does is it displays a nice accordion of tasks coming from a SharePoint task list. And you can see here I have tasks that are in different statuses. And the different status they are in is one little element of the accordion here. So I have one that is completed, one that's not started, one that's deferred, and two that are in progress. This was built with the jQuery accordion. Also, at the bottom, I have a pie chart that was built with the Chartist JS library that basically looks at that same data and then shows me a representation of what percentage of each status are these tasks in. If you're curious, the tasks just come from the SharePoint list here, where I've added tasks to them, assigned different statuses to them, and that pretty much is my data that drives this web part you can see here running in my SharePoint workbench on my dev site. So how do we build it? Well, the first thing I would like to point out is that I first installed the jQuery UI, Chartist, and Moment libraries by executing these commands in the same directory where I had my SharePoint Framework web part. So npm install the name of the library -- save, and that will install the library into your web part project. Then I installed the TypeScript definitions for jQuery UI and Chartist with the following commands right here. And the Moment library's TypeScript definitions are automatically installed when you run this npm command. So that's why I did not need to install their TypeScript definitions with that command down there at the bottom. One thing to note is that the project we started with this already had the jQuery library installed. So I started with the project from module 1 in the training content. And if we take a look at that project right here, here are all the different modules of the SharePoint Framework Training content. I'm using exercise 3, which is built on the Hello World web part jQuery project. That one actually gets created back in module 1. So I started with that one. I ran those npm commands to install my libraries and TypeScript definitions, and then I enhanced the code to build the web part. So let me show you the different things I did here to reference these libraries and use them inside of the web part. So after I had them installed, I added these import statements right here to import those libraries and give them the name that I want for them as I use them inside of my web part. Once that was done, to enhance that Hello World jQuery sample we had, first thing I did is I created an interface model for the list items that I'm going to use in this web part. I did that right here. You can learn about how to create these interface models and use the SharePoint HTTP module to bring data back. Here's the SharePoint HTTP client module I was just talking about. So that's how I get that data back out of the SharePoint list. I created a list name private data member here and called it tasks. I'm going to use that to point to that tasks list that I pulled the information back from. Then I implemented a get list items method. This method here uses the SharePoint REST API, as you can see right there, to return the list items from the SharePoint list. After I did that, I actually went back up to my render method and I invoked that get list items method right here, and that returns me my collection of items, which I will then render out to in the web part as I iterate through that collection and then prepare it to be rendered. If I bounce over to my SCSS file here, I also added these three classes here to style the output when it goes out to the web part. If I hop back over to the main web part class file, I can show you the render list items method that I created. It's pretty long. It's right here. This goes through the items that come back from my query to the SharePoint API to get the list items. And inside of it, this is where I'm building up my HTML and looping through the items to actually build the jQuery accordion and the chartist chart at the bottom. So if I go through, a good way to show where I've used them is just double click on them here. So here I can see jQuery is the one I've highlighted now. As I go through my class and peruse it here, here's you can see where we use jQuery. So this was to find the root DOM element that I wanted to actually then find the accordion inside of it right there so I can build up that user interface. If we look at how we use Chartist, I'll select that one and we can select down, scroll down through here, and here we can see this is where I use the Chartist library to create the pie chart. That's how that was done. And then finally, if I look at how we use the moment library, that's used in a couple spots here. We're pretty much using the moment library here to take the start date and the task due date out of the values returned from the SharePoint list, and then we're formatting them into the month / day / year format. So that's how I use those three libraries right there to build that up. Other important things to point out, as you look at the render method, you can also see I have require statements here for my jQuery UI and Chartist min CSS files, so that I can pull in the CSS I need to actually style these components. So after I made those changes to it, that's how we're able to render the Chartist pie down here at the bottom, the jQuery accordion up at the top, and then also how you can see I used moment library to format the start date and the due date for each item there. In summary, in this module, we've talked about how to install JavaScript libraries, how to configure library bundling for JavaScript, and how to use the JavaScript libraries in a web part. You can learn more about SharePoint Framework and all the things we've talked about here in the SharePoint Patterns and Practices. You can get to this via the URL aka.ms/SharePointPNP. There's a ton of code samples and solutions, reusable components, a lot of guidance documentation, and also monthly community calls that you can watch here to learn all about the SharePoint Framework, SharePoint add-ins, Microsoft Graph, and Office 365 APIs.